This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Jane Combe, Market Analyst with the Grape Growers of Ontario, and GGO is hosting a series of webinars on transition planning this winter, and I'm glad that you're able to join us for this first of the webinar series. A bit of housekeeping, participants are muted to avoid background noise during the presentation, so please post questions in the Q&A or the chat buttons that should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we do welcome any questions. You know, we've heard a lot from our members, particularly over the last year, about succession or transition planning. Questions like, how will you bring the next generation into the farm? What if your children are not interested in the business? You know, what if something happens to me? How do I make sure that my family and my business are able to manage going forward? And every situation is different, but there are also some very common things that need to be considered. So we're pleased to have Andrea DeGroot with us today to look at how to get started. Andrea is a business advisor and transition specialist with Farm Credit Canada. She specializes in farm and business transitions, providing clarity to family dynamics. And with her experience in farm management, she collaborates with technical advisors to address business structure and facilitate conversations. Andrea, I'm going to steal your thunder, Andrea, but she grew up on a small beef and crop farm in Southern Ontario. And after earning a degree in agriculture business at the University of Guelph, she worked in agriculture and commercial lending throughout Ontario. She served as managing director of Ontario Pork Industry Council, and she and her husband own and operate their family farm outside of Stratford. I want to thank Farm Credit Canada for making Andrea available to us today. And we also have Bill Stockwell and Audrey Moran from Farm Credit on the line with us. Andrea's topic is taking stock of your transition planning, and we're looking forward to some very practical tips on getting started. With that, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Mary Jane, for not only for having me, but also for the introduction. As we switch, we're going to move from this slide to the slide deck that I had sent. So while Mary Jane is taking care of that, I'm going to take just a moment to say thank you for even having me. When Mary Jane reached out, I was hopeful that we would actually be in person and that I could come down and tour a couple of wineries. But since our world is not quite working like that today, I'm still happy to be here. I'm coming to you from the basement of our farm just outside of Stratford. And Mary Jane and I were speaking before. We have a ton of snow. So over the last number of days, we've actually gotten quite a few snow squalls off the lake. And so my kids are actually they're doing online schooling, but right now with rural internet, they're all outside. I don't know what they're doing. I hope no one gets hurt, but they're outside playing in the snow right now. So with that, we're going to get started. The topic of my presentation today is taking stock of your transition planning. And so before we get started into that, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever we are coming from, in Southern Ontario, that we are meeting on the original land of the Indigenous people. And we also want to recognize the contributions that the Métis, the Inuit, and other Indigenous people have made both in shaping shaping and strengthening our community, our province, and our country. And so when I was talking with Mary Jane, she had asked me to be the kickoff of your transition planning and succession planning webinars, and I believe you have another couple seminars coming your way in the next coming months. And so I wanted to take some time to really acknowledge that this presentation is in pre-transition planning. So this is not going to be about the technical strategies that you're going to be discussing when you call your accountant or your lawyer or your financial planner. This is about what are we going to do, or if we haven't done anything yet. That's the conversation. This is the pre-work to the transition planning. And so with that, we're going to go to the next slide. And we're going to start with having some conversations about where do we even start with succession planning. And when I started to create this presentation, I really wanted to acknowledge that we need to simplify this process. When we talk about succession planning, we were finding that farmers weren't taking the steps forward in order to be successful in the succession planning process. And what we were finding is that they were jumping ahead in the process. So they were jumping to the tax strategies. They were jumping to the equalization, like how do I make sure that my kids, the value that I'm leaving them is really kind of fair, or if not fair, explainable from one child to the next. And what we were finding is that people would go to specific professionals and they wouldn't have consistent information that they were sharing with these professionals. And so the result of that is that there was a lot of surprises through that transition process, and there was a lot of duplication. They were having to circle back and go back further in the process because things weren't getting done, and they were trying to move things ahead. So we want to provide some clarity and a level playing field. That's what we're going with. That's what we're trying to establish today, where we want clarity for the family and we want a smoother process. And in order to do that, we need to start at the beginning. And so one of the things that we really wanted to start with is the terminology. So succession planning, we have estate planning, we have transition planning. What do all of those mean? So we're going to start with succession, and that is specifically when we're talking about the business. So we're talking about the management, the business assets themselves, and the ongoing operation, whether that's an operating company or whatever's included in that business. When we talk about succession, that is kind of the box that we're talking about. And when we talk about estate planning, we're speaking at that point of personal wealth, of family. That's where the wills come in. That's where life insurance tends to be a lot more than in that succession piece. And then transition is where we have both, because in farming, or as in growing grapes, whatever kind of agriculture you're in, we can't deal with the farmer without dealing with the farm. And in so many cases, the farm is where the lion's share of the estate, of the net worth, of the equity is. And so that transition recognizes that in order for us to actually deal with the agricultural community, we need to deal with the farm and the farmer. And so if we can identify at what point and what aspect of this transition plan that we're focusing on, and recognizing that there are different terms that are being used out there, that can start to clear up some of that clarity as to who am I talking for what kind of section. And just to take a moment, transition planning is not a DIY. This is not a do-it-yourself project. This aspect of the pre-transition is where you can do some of the heavy lifting of the data organizing before we get to the transition plan. So to be clear, what I'm presenting today isn't a transition plan. This is just getting yourself ready so that you can start working with your technical partners for creating that transition plan. And the hopes are, if you're organized in that pre-transition, then you're going to be able to save some time in terms you're not going to have to circle back around and re-ask some of those questions. Hopefully we're going to save some money, because a lot of this data collection that we're going to be identifying today, if you don't do it, your accountant, your lawyer, or your financial planner will, and they're going to charge you for it. And so there's a lot of good reasons why you should do this rather than paying somebody else to do this. And hopefully getting yourself organized will help avoid some of the headaches of circling back and having these false starts in the transition process. So hopefully that'll keep everything moving in the right direction. So if we can go to the next slide. I was just kind of trying to paint that picture of why we're going to take the time to prepare and organize all of our details here. And I know when we think about preparing the grapes or preparing your field, it's something that you do on a regular basis. Now, grapes, not so much as a regular traditional row crop or corn crop or whatever the case may be, because you guys are not doing it every year. But it can seem like transition planning is something that's so far-fetched because it's only you do it once or twice in your life. But in reality, a lot of the skills that you use in your everyday farm are things that are going to be transferable, or you can actually use in your transition planning. An example would be like, as you can see this checklist, there's the land rental agreements, your inputs, your labor, your GPS marketing plans, all of those cost of production quotes. A lot of that preparation is done in the previous months leading up to whenever you're going to attempt to plant your crops. And that's where you're not going to sit down and discuss a new grape variety without having some of your work done. And my comparison to that is I encourage you to not show up to the accountant to talk about, okay, now I'm ready to do my transition without having some of this homework done. So the things that you do on a daily basis are hard. And yes, this transition is hard, but you can do it as well. So that's my pep talk, that you guys have the skill set to do this. And we're going to help go through what that process actually looks like. So we're going to go to the next slide. And there's 7 key assets, or 7 key checklists here that I'm going to be talking through today. And so each one of them, we're going to spend some time digging deep, and I'm going to have at the end of this an actual checklist. And it's going to be each of these 7 categories. It's going to address what needs to be done in terms of an action for each of these 7 categories. It's also going to have links to other resources, links to other articles. And when there was myself and there was one other person, her name is Maggie Van Camp, so she's the national director with BDO. We started talking through this concept of getting yourself organized in this pre-transition timeframe. We started this last summer, and we wanted to understand where people were getting stuck. And so we reached out to accountants, specifically BDO, but I also reached out to some of the MNP and some local and more smaller sized accountants. We asked a lot of different lawyers, not just from Ontario, but from across the country. We reached out to some financial advisors, and we asked, like, what kind of information do people need to have before they sit down with you? And that's where this list came from. So we've done some of this investigation and saying, why are we doing this? Why is this information being organized in this manner? And that's because that's directly from the technical partner saying, this is how you can help us help our clients. And so before we get started, number one, there's going to be actually a lot more detailed transition checklist that will break down these 7 aspects into a lot more detail. That's going to be shared with you, and it's a PDF, and it's a web-based checklist, which means that you can save it and you can open it as long as you're on Wi-Fi or any kind of connection, and those links will be active and continue to work. And so it's a good way to organize how you're going to be doing this. Secondly, to take a moment to think about the housekeeping items. And so this is about when you're creating all of these different information data points, how are you going to manage that information? Because you're going to need a lot of this information, but then your accountants and your lawyers and your financial planners are also going to need that. So to make sure that you're making some of this in duplication, if you're going to be printing things off or if you're going to be saving them electronically, make sure that you also tell somebody, a trusted partner, maybe one of your power of attorney or something along that line, about where all this information is stored, because that's going to be really helpful in the case that anything happens, but it's also helpful that everything's going to be organized in one spot. So just when you're listening through, I don't want you to be focused on the links and the exact details that I'm spelling out for you, because this checklist will actually, a lot more detailed checklist will be shared with you at the end. So I encourage you to sit back, kind of listen through each of these categories, and then we can go from there. So let's get started. And we're going to start with the family and business organizational chart. So if I can have the next slide up. So as you can see, there's a very formal business organizational chart. And if you have that for your business, fantastic. We're going to park that for right now. And we're going to start with the family. And so this may not look like a true business organizational chart, and that's okay. What I'm hoping and what I'm encouraging people is to take just a page, any kind of regular document, and start listing out who's in your family. And when I say who's in your family, I would like you to identify them by their legal names, as well as what they commonly go by. And this seems like this is maybe a simple note, but this is actually something that's really, really critical. And as we're moving forward, and I've seen this in some situations where we're already writing documents, we're getting further transition plans, and then all of a sudden there's confusion as to who we're actually talking about. So right from the beginning, let's take some time to acknowledge who's in your family, their legal common names. Are they married? Where do they live? Do they live in Canada or do they live outside of Canada? This is also a place where you can start creating a little bit more of a library of what's gone on within that family. So if there's been business support, or if there's been, support in terms of loans for houses, for university, vehicles, whatever the case may be, you can start to document per child, make a little case of how you've supported them going forward. And again, it's in one place. So this kind of consolidates your thoughts into one spot. There's also, this is a great time where we can take some specific moments to recognize if there's any special needs. So if any of your family members do require a Henson Trust, as one example, where there's some special needs that's supported by the government, we need to have that formally recognized. And the sooner that we can recognize that, the better. As well, this is where we may have other needs that aren't so complex, but we may have people who live on properties that we own or the business owns. And so take some time to recognize where they are and where they live and what's the ownership structure of that. As we're moving down this, we're going to then take some time to think about the business structure. So if we have a formal organizational chart, that is fantastic. Let's recognize that. And then let's take some time to recognize the family members that are specific within that organizational chart. And this is a spot where I would really like to document or to note if promises have been made. And this is a complicated question, because if there's been insinuations that, this business is going to be yours, or you're going to be the next VP of sales, or whatever the case may be, this is not a formal legal document, but this is your chance to write down if you've made some of those insinuation, promises, suggestions, whatever you want to call them. This is a great place for it to be documented, so that your technical partners know the kind of expectations or thoughts that are coming down the pipeline. And so this set of documents, I would encourage a family note and a business note, and it's about taking a snapshot today. I fully recognize that these relationships and these roles, whether it be a family role or a business role, is going to change. But right now, what we're asking for is that this is a snapshot of where it is today. We will deal with the future state. We will deal with whomever's going to be taking on those new roles. That's the whole process. But right now, this is just a snapshot of what your current scenario is, and make sure to write down and date when you actually did this, so that people know this was the current state analysis as of February 2022. So that is the family and business organizational chart. So that's step one. Step two, we're going to go into, so we're going to go to the next slide, is the farm asset catalog. And this may seem like you're duplicating your efforts, especially if you're sharing your financial statements with everyone. You think, well, we should know, the accountant should know, the lawyer should know which key assets we're talking about. And that's not always the case. And the whole intent of this farm asset catalog is to clarify and to identify which of the business assets, farm assets, business assets, we're really talking about, and to make sure that we have clear information on where they're at right now. And so that's the intent, is to have clarity about which assets we're talking about, and the information that's going to be included in that catalog. We start with the legal description, so the lot and concession of that actual real estate. Then the year that we acquired it, maybe the purchase price, who's on title. Is this owned in which corporation, or is this owned personally? Is there any division of title? So in Ontario, well, actually all across the country, it's not uncommon if you have two farms or two real estate located side by side, that one will have a slightly different title so that they don't amalgamate into one title. And so those kinds of details are exactly what we want to acknowledge and take some time to put on this farm asset catalog. We also want to think about what an approximate current value is. And I say approximate because as we continue down this farm transition process, there will be formalized valuations that a third party will have to, well, depending on the process, but most likely there's going to be a third party valuation that's going to be completed. So this is just to give what I say context. If you bought I'm going to say a farm, we'll use that as an example, for $150,000 and it's now worth $2 million, rather than if you bought a farm that you paid $1.5 million and now it's worth $2 million. That gives the accountants some idea of the timing and of the scope of the capital asset increases. And that's important when we're starting to think about how we're going to manage taxes. It starts putting some framework into their mind in terms of what is the potential for that tax implications. That's an accountant conversation, but that's the information that why we're giving this to them right at the beginning. So we started with real estate, but we also would have equipment. We would have potentially, if it's another kind of farm, we would have livestock. We would have any specific, in your perspective, I'm thinking inventory would be a huge perspective that we're going to need to consider. And then I want you guys to take a moment to look at this asset catalog and just to pause. Because the values that we started with at the beginning of most people's farming career and the values that we're dealing with today are considerably different. And so I would like just to take a moment to really let that sink in, to see the farm operations, the business operations that have that you guys have built. It's amazing and it's fantastic to see the capacity that has been increased. It's also a double-edged sword because these high real estate values are making this a lot more complex. But at the same point, we'll get to that in the future. For right now, just take a look at that and let it resonate into you and look at the successes that you've had over the years. So that's the farm asset catalog. The more detail that you can put into this, the better it's going to be for your technical partners. And I would also encourage that this is a living document, so you can come back to it and add as much detail as you're going to in the future. So that's number 2 is your farm asset catalog. And then the next one, we're going to go to personal net worth statement. And so again, regardless who you're going to be working with, this is going to be an incredibly important net worth statement. And so when we think of the farm business, we already did a lot in terms of recognizing those key farm assets. But this is a net worth statement, which means that we need to take the total assets and then we need to recognize the debt. And so when you look at that farm business, you can lean back on that number 2 onto that farm asset catalog, but we need to acknowledge the debts that also go with that. So you can either acknowledge that as if it's a corporation and you want to put a specific line on there to say the farm business corporation, the net value of it, that is great. But it's really important that as you're filling out this net worth statement, that you have a balanced approach. So you're going to list out all of your assets, whether that's your RSPs, your investments, any recreational properties, personally owned properties, investments in other businesses as well. All of those need to be acknowledged, and then the liabilities as well. So make sure that it's a balanced approach and that we're working on a net basis. One other aspect that I like to remind people is this is a good place to take a moment to think about heirloom items. Oftentimes when people come in and they need to focus on a couple of key items, and the farm business takes a lot of the attention. It's where the vast majority of the assets are. It's where the complications arise in terms of value. And that is really, they need to deal with that farm business. And so other things tend to get left to the back or maybe even missed. And heirloom items is one of those key areas that it may not be huge in terms of value. We may be talking value of less than $5,000. but taking some time to recognize maybe those antique tractors or some jewelry or some specific furniture, whatever the case may be, it's important to still write them down so you don't miss them in the overall process. And the personal net worth statement is a great place where they may not be a part of your business, but you still want to address them, whether that be in the will at a future state or just to make sure that those items don't get missed from the top. And another aspect is the life insurance. And so I would also include the current value of that life insurance if you were to buy that life insurance policy out. Or it's even a good note just to say, if you already have life insurance, if it's tied to the business, that's fine, acknowledge that. But if you have personal life insurance, wherever it is, please acknowledge it on your personal net worth statement. And if you're looking for a place to organize on that checklist, there's going to be an actual link to the FCC website. And on that website, we have a net worth statement which categorizes things in a nice, concise manner. And it may make it easier for you to go through and make sure you're not going to miss any of those items. So that is something that you can refer to later in that checklist. So personal net worth statement is number 3. And we're going to go to number 4. We're speeding along here. Number 4 is your will. And the reality of the pandemic has really amplified the need for looking at your will and thinking about who your executors, your power of attorney, your healthcare directives, who holds those? Are they in Ontario? Specifically with the pandemic, I know my family has had some examples where my grandmother was in the hospital. She was ill. And unfortunately, both of my aunts that had the healthcare directive, neither of them were in the country and they were unable to actually get there. And so it created a challenging situation. You can deal with it, but it's something that I would say before this was a non-issue. Even if you did have somebody that was out of the province, that was your healthcare directive or that power of attorney, you could easily get them to your location so that they could deal with your estate concerns. But with the current restrictions that we're having, this is top of mind. And this was actually something that was highlighted by an Ontario lawyer as well as one from Calgary. And they said, if you can get this message across that you really need to think about who is your power of attorney and your healthcare directive today, they said that would be something that was very much appreciated, because that is one of the common challenges that they're facing right now. So let's take a moment and think about your will. How often are you updating that will? How old is your current will? I tend to see that most wills are quite old. And I'm saying that like 15, 20 years old. And given the complexity and how much, especially with farm values and other things that have gone on, the will and what you had wanted from that time to the current reality of the farm business, or specifically what you want in your life, has changed a lot. And so setting some discipline to review your will on an every 5-year basis is really critical, or at major life changes. And specifically when we're looking at transition planning, I get a lot of pushback saying, Andrea, that's the whole point. We're gonna change and we're gonna update that will when we get this plan done. And the reality is, if your will is already 12 years old and it takes you 2 to 3 years before you're going to actually have your transition plan done, that's not good enough. Start updating a few things right now, and then in 2 years, when you've made those decisions with how you're going to transition these assets or the management of specific farm management or businesses, you can update it again at that time. But be honest about how old that will is. And if it's more than 10 years, please do almost like an emergency will update before you start into the transition plan. And I know for myself that when I sit down with farmers at the table, they tend to start asking questions about wills, and everyone directs their opinion and their view to the senior generation. And because they think that's the most critical will that is being done. And that's really where the conversation starts, and they try to end it there. And I don't support that. Everyone who's 18 years and older needs a will. I'm going to say that again. Everyone 18 years and older needs a will. And every time, it's either that 5-year time frame or every major life event. So if you get married, have a great wedding, update your will. You have kids, enjoy the kids, update your will. You can see where I'm going with this. If you come home to be involved in the business, update your will. I have a story to share why I'm so passionate about the fact that it's not just the key owners who need their will updated. And this situation is actually from a couple of years ago, and it's a dairy example, but I think it's relevant for you as well. And so there was a fairly large dairy operation. The senior generation, so we're going to call them Generation 1, had identified the successor and his wife, and they decided, they went through the whole process, and they transitioned that farm down to their son. And the son and the daughter were jointly managing it. Everything was great. Unfortunately, the son passed away suddenly, and everything went to the daughter, or the daughter-in-law, I guess I would say. Everything's still great at this point. Generation 3, so their children are interested. They're coming home. Everything's still going well. And then fast forward, the daughter-in-law or the wife gets remarried. Everything's still okay. That gentleman respects the operation and what has become, and everything's kind of still moving along. But the wife never got the will updated, and she was killed in a car accident. The entire operation then transitioned because of provincial laws and how this was actually executed. All of the farm went to the new husband, and he recognized that this wasn't right. And he signed all of the farm assets, which were about $15 million, back over to his stepchildren and to his previous wife's father-in-law. I'll say it that way. So the goal here is to recognize that you should not be doing your business planning on the basis that your daughter-in-law's next husband's a good guy, because that could have gone really wrong. And so it's crucial that anyone connected with this farm or this business has an active will, and you know where these assets and what the where that asset will go in the future. And it's also important that I think that example shows the importance that good stories, people do good things all the time in transition planning. We share too many of the bad stories. And so that's why I wanted to highlight a situation where the farm continued and it was okay. And I just really can't stress enough that let's not plan on your daughter-in-law's next husband being a good guy. That's not what we want to do. And this brings up another tool that I see often that you can use, not just for your will preparation, but also just for your organization and really taking that next step. And it's called the Because I Love You list. And the link for this will be in that checklist that I keep referring to. So this is it's a fillable PDF. So it's about 4 pages long, and it has everything from where your investments are, who your lawyer is, where everything's kind of located in terms of passwords or different things. It's a really critical document, but it also says, if you have specific, like electricians, there's a lot of really organic information there that's a part of your business. And depending on how your business is set up, maybe some people aren't going to know this information. And I have personally found a lot of success in encouraging people to do the Because I Love You list. And a lot of that comes from the fact that this is something you can start. This is something that you can get yourself mentally organized. And it's a sense of accomplishment that you've gone through and got a few of these items organized in one spot. That is helpful. That gives you a bit of motivation to keep going. And it's also, when you're thinking of from an organizational standpoint, we have a lot of big items, but these are a lot of the little details that in the case that something tragic happens, your family will know some of those key items, or at least know who to reach out to get the information. So the Because I Love You list is a really good update. And again, if you can get back into that discipline of every 5 years making sure that it's updated, that is going to be a great tool, not only for you, but also for your family in the event that something happens. So number 4 was review your will. The next slide is going to be talking about living budgets. And I call them living budgets rather than cost of living budgets, because the intent here is that you want to live your life. And so in order to do this, you have to know what the costs are going to be to do that. As businesses, we tend to lean on writing off a number of expenses, and that's not always acknowledged in terms of how much that value of living on, say, a farm or on the business, how much do we actually write off? Gas, for one example, the vehicles, all of the costs associated with the actual, like the property taxes, maybe the heat, the hydro, all of those kinds of living costs. Sometimes it's easy for them not to get acknowledged in your, what you would consider your budget or your cost of living in today, because they're invisible costs. They're within the business. And so this is a 2-phase step. This is, I should say, a 2-phase project. Phase 1 is taking a look at whatever your circumstance is now, acknowledging how much it costs you to live. And then further down the road, when you start to want to think of what that next stages are, and I'm going to use the term retirement budget, but the reality is, if your circumstance is going to change, so if you're going to move off, maybe say that key operation, or if you're wanting to work less, I mean, not stop working, but work less and have more people, more traveling, those kinds of things. What's that future cost of living going to look like? And a lot of people underestimate what it costs to live. I often start this conversation with asking both parties, junior and senior, so everybody, this is for everyone, it's not just for one particular generation, about how much it's going to cost them to live. And it's traditionally everyone underestimates. So this is about knowledge. It's not about the CRA. So it's not about making sure you pay the appropriate amount of taxes. That's not the conversation here. The conversation really is around, do you know what it's going to cost to live? And do we have everything set up in the appropriate amount? So on that checklist that I keep referring to, FCC has created a cost of living budget, and it has been helpful for people to take some time to break it down into, again, 2 different categories. So we have current state and future state, but the next kind of ways of breaking that down is when you're trying to think and come up with the values that you're actually going to be spending, is it helpful to do it on a monthly basis or on an annual basis? Because ideally we want to know how much it's going to cost us in 1 year to live, but breaking it down on a monthly basis tends to be a little bit more palatable, and we get better information, more realistic numbers. So there's a link to a cost of budget, into a cost of budget process, and there's no right or wrong answer here. This is for you to understand what that living budget's going to be. And this is one aspect where we tend to kind of go in circles, especially because when we're looking at the business viability, people want to know how we're going to bring in that next generation. Can we support multiple families off of this farm or this business? And or if we're going to move forward, the senior generation tend to leave money in, and whatever they're taking out of the business, it tends to be connected to the pension that they've established moving forward. And so we start to do some projections in terms of how we're going to move forward in our transition planning, in our budgets, in our buyout values. And then it keeps coming back to well, how much does mom and dad need? And a really tricky conversation is if mom and dad underestimate how much their cost of living is going to be, they don't want to have to come back to the kids to say, well, I actually need more money. and I've seen this, and it's not a great spot for either generation, because if the junior generation was planning with one certain value in mind, and now their parents are coming back who have left money in the business and saying we need more, A, they want to help them, B, that money in the business is still technically the senior generations. But what if they've already expanded with only that ability to move forward? Then we're really stuck in a hard place. And so the circular aspect that I find is the senior generation are asking the junior generation, figure out how we're going to do this and how we're going to work through the budgets moving forward. And the junior generation is asking the parents, well, how much do you need? And the living budgets is one of those issues that's caught right smack in the middle of this. And so that's why taking the time to do this is really crucial. And so for when we're moving forward into that retirement budget or that future state budget, another thing to consider is, do you have benefits? Do you need to set some money aside for healthcare considerations? That gets more complicated, and that's a future state conversation. Likewise, the idea of trips and going places right now obviously isn't necessarily an option, but moving forward, what's that budget look like for trips if we're going to be continuing to do that? This is the area that we're going to spend the time to think what moving forward and the cost of living is going to look like. So we're going to wrap up living budgets, and the next one, I call it farm financial checkup, but really this is business financial checkup. So we're really taking back and looking at the business viability, taking a lot of moments to look at what that business viability is, and what's the business's ability to move forward here. And so a couple of key questions that I would really encourage people to look at is, what's your net farm income? That's like level one. But then we need to dive down to, if we're moving forward, there tends to be a lot more debt that's going to be taken on, because we're either buying out equity share or we're buying assets. And so when we're thinking of that business viability check-in, what's the debt service capacity? What has it been previously? And what is it going to have to change in the future? Are we going to be changing the makeup of the actual farm business? Are we going to be dividing this? What is actually going on in that business circumstance? And then also taking a look at the 5-year past profitability trends and understanding what was driving that, either positive profitability trends, or if there's some other aspects that are maybe risks or concerns or even future opportunities. When we look at that profitability trend, we can start expanding the scope, saying, what's the profit drivers and what's the risks within that business? And then lastly, I really do encourage people, especially the next generation, to take some time to understand what those gross margins are and those cost production. And depending on the situation, depending on how the process has gone currently in terms of financial management, what level of understanding do either generation have of this? Has one person taken on that financial, like that chief financial officer role, and they have all of the information? Is this something that has been discussed in great detail? If the junior generation is trying to put together some farm business plans, some projections, but they don't have access to all of this information, that's going to be really difficult for them to do. And I see that all the time, where the senior generations asks, well, make a business plan. How are we going to move forward with this? And they have really limited information and insight into the current financial situation. And so that creates a lot of challenges, and it really creates some conflict within the family about that information and access to that information. So when we're talking about this, yes, this is a senior generation conversation, but it's also a check-in to say, how are financials being discussed currently? Is everyone involved? Or at what point do we need to start bringing that next generation into this conversation? And in terms of, what if you're not comfortable calculating your debt servicing? What if you're not comfortable figuring out what those profitability trends or that cost of production is, because it's changing and we have a volatile information, we have supply chain issues. There's lots of reasons why this can be a hard conversation to have. So you're going to reach out. Your accountant should be able to help you move through that, as should your banker or your FCC rep. And the better questions that you have prepared about specifically what you need to know and what you want to know, if you can go in there with a lot of specific asks, you're going to get better information out. So that would be my other recommendation, is if you feel like you have a pretty decent understanding of your business financial situation, but you want to narrow it down, say understanding your gross margins and how you can manage those, write down some questions before you get to the office, and then that's going to be more helpful in moving you forward. And I guess from there, we're going to go to the last one. And so we're going to have the next slide. And I know this sounds really kind of corny, but I want you to dream big. So in this last slide, or the last slide of this top 7, is dream big. And right now, at this phase, it's important to remember that this is big concepts. This is big picture. So I really want you to not focus in on the small details. I want you to take a step back and look at where you are in your business, where you are in your life. And I want you to start thinking through, like, how do you vision your life and your business 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Are you still very much involved? Or are you doing something else? Are you stepping aside in that 5 to 10? What's the timeline that you're looking at? And based on your current goals, what would that impact to the management be? If you're already a sole proprietor and you really need to bring in that next generation or that new management, how much of a learning curve are they going to have? Is this going to be steep, or is this going to be something that's going to naturally happen? And how are you going to deal with the decision making and the labor? Those are different challenges. So when we're looking at this as a business and as personal, those are two different categories. And this is where I often encourage people, the senior generation, to think back when they started. Could they have foreseen how large or how complex their businesses have become? And oftentimes the answer is no, not at all. We would never have guessed where we are today from where we started. And that's a great thing. Likewise, as we're thinking about the next future steps, I want you to remember that we can still have a huge amount of growth. There can still be a huge amount of change that's coming to this business and to you personally. And so I know that sounds scary, but it's also a fantastic opportunity. And now the harder part is taking a thought of, if everything has been about the business, not everything, but if the focus of a lot of your day-to-day has been that business and driving that business success, an idea or a thought process of lessening that time in the business and spending time outside of it can seem daunting, because what does that look like? And a situation or a conversation I tend to have is with both of the senior generation. I ask them to draw a circle and think about their days and how would you divide that circle, like into a pie kind of concept. Some of it's maybe going to be in the business. Maybe some of it's going to be with grandchildren, maybe traveling, volunteerism. There's lots of different options that you have, creation, like recreational or hobbies, however you see that working out. And I ask them to draw it out, to actually kind of identify what that pie-shaped circle is going to look like. And I did this in the fall, and it was with a business owner. They had grown their business very significantly. They have very adept next generation that are able to step in, and they're going to be doing great things. And this idea of what's next is really struggling for these two parents who created this right from scratch. And so for them, the wife had spent a lot of time thinking about what the next stages are going to look like. They are not walking away from the business, but they're shifting their time. And So when I asked the wife this question, she had a long list of things that she was going to do, and she had a plan of how she was going to do that. And I likewise asked the husband what was his expectations. And he said, I'm only going to work 40 hours a week. And in his mind, he was really proud that he was only working 40 hours of the week. Looked over to the wife, she was less proud. That was not what she was expecting. And so I think it's important to remember that there's going to be some compromise at this point. And this is for you to take some time with your partner to recognize what does each of the next steps look like, because it could be very different between the husband and the wife. And it may take some time for that agreement to settle out. But this is the time to do this. And I encourage you to have this conversation together. So this is where I would encourage the senior generation to take some time to discuss this and not include everybody else in the family. There's a time for family meetings, and that is in the future. But right now, it's really important that the senior generation are in alignment about at least some core changes and some core focuses that they want to focus on. This is an open conversation, so there's no right or wrong answer at this point. We're trying to understand where people's views are at. And like I said earlier, compromise is going to be the name of the game at this point, because there's going to be lots of changes coming, and there's going to be lots of further conversation. So let's not get caught up in the details when we're in this dreaming phase. This is to help shift your thought process towards some new goals. And that's not a minor detail. If a huge part of your career and your life has been focused on the business, shifting where the business is not your key goal, that's going to be hard. And it's going to be harder potentially for one part of the couple as opposed to the other. So recognize that it's going to take some time for both generations to really wrap their heads around this. And again, I just want to refocus on the fact that using families as sounding boards, I would encourage that at this point you're using each other as a sounding board as opposed to using your family. And part of that is there's no contracts right now. This is nothing is formalized, nothing is solid. This is just taking the time to start thinking about what ifs. So that's number 7, is the dream big. So we're going to shift to the next slide, and I'm going to try to talk about why these are so important. So one is taking the time to work through these 7 steps. You're going to get yourself and your partner organized. And hopefully you'll increase that alignment so that you're actually both focused on the same things. The goal here is to have better discussions with your accountant, your lawyer, or your financial consultant, whomever you're working with. If you have more information and you feel more organized, you're going to ask better questions and you're going to have better discussions with them. And that's going to move your process along further. When you get yourself organized and you kind of know some of these key bases and you feel like you're going into a meeting prepared, you're going to have more confidence to take that next step. And it's going to show leadership to that junior generation that you're serious about doing transition plans. I know I've met with some families that they're meeting with me, but I'm not necessarily sure that they're really prepared to take those next steps. But when you have this level of organization, it does say that you're ready to seriously discuss how this is going to happen. It's, again, we're not making any promises, but there's serious discussion moving forward, and that's a good thing. Reiterate that better understanding is going to you're going to be able to ask better questions and saving money, because this level of organization has to happen whether you do it or your accountant or your lawyer does it. So it's going to be a double win. If you're able to do it, you can save the money and not have to pay them to do it. And I strongly believe that you'll be able to be in a better position to be able to work with your technical partners as you move forward. So one of my last slides here, we're wrapping up, is the challenge that I would encourage to each of you is there's 7 steps here. Take an hour for the next 7 weeks and identify a little bit of that time and take on one of these 7 steps. And if you take this larger process and start breaking it down, it is something that you will actually be able to see some traction. You'll be able to get ahead, and even moving forward, and you can move these steps, and you don't have to start with family and business organization. You can move them around as long as you do all 7. But this will get you in a discipline of actually doing something connected to your transition plan each week. And that discipline is really important, and it stops that that procrastination that you just aren't getting anything done. This is the great thing on these 7 items, is that this is scalable. So you can have really large, complex, multi-corporation business structures and a straightforward business, farm business. This level of information is going to be needed for both of those extremes. And so I like this idea that this is what you can do in bite-sized pieces right now. And I can't reiterate enough that you've done a ton of work to get the business successful to this point. This level of organization is completely within your bandwidth. You can do this. And this is important, that when you show up to the accountant and you say, okay, I'm ready to start my transition plan, you show up with something. And that matters. And it really is critical to moving the transition plan forward. When I talk with families, one of the lines that I use is that transition is not a spectator sport. You have to play, you have to participate, which means that you can't just call up your accountant or your lawyer and say, I'm ready to do this, and let them figure out all the pieces. This is your business. This is your legacy. These are your assets. You get to decide what's going to happen with them, and your technical partners are there to support and figure out all the technical aspects of how to do that. But what you're going to do, you get to decide that. And so that's my presentation. I'm not sure how we're doing for timing. I'm hoping that we have some time for questions, Mary Jane.
Absolutely. I think Andrea has given us a lot of food for thought, sorry, and in bite-sized pieces. And so now is your opportunity to ask questions, and please post them in the chat section. I've also had a few questions that were submitted ahead of time, Andrea, so we'll ask you those. Okay. The first question is whether you are available to meet with clients or with farm families.
Yes. So I am a part of a national team. Audrey Moran, she's actually on the call today too. She and I are located here in Ontario. I'm in Stratford. She's in closer to Tillsonburg, Norwich area, and we are able to meet. So what I would encourage is you reach out to your local FCC office, and they will, whether you know them, you don't have to be an FCC client or not. Our services are free, all complimentary for FCC and non-FCC clients. And then from there, they will connect, any of the FCC offices will connect you with us, and we'll set up a meeting.
Thank you. So one of the questions submitted is, where do you start if you're the younger generation wanting to plan your future and your parents aren't willing to let go of the reins?
It's a great question, and it's a scenario that we run into actually a fair amount. And so with the younger generation, I like to do a check-in as to how they're asking about this. Sometimes in the enthusiasm, is it coming across that you want your parents to step out, or is it that you want to step in to help them, take some stress off them, you want to learn? I find that sometimes working with a younger generation around the verbiage, around the words that they're using, helps kind of open some doors to having some conversations. So it's about managing the expectations. If the senior generation feels like the younger generation just want to get the reins and kick them out, they're going to push back pretty hard. And if we can manage people's expectations, like the younger generation wants a bit more responsibility, they see the parents are stressed and they want to be able to help, or they have a genuine curiosity and they want to learn about the marketing of the grapes, or if they want to learn about more of the wholesale aspect of the business. It's around figuring out how to open and leverage those conversations And sometimes that does require a third party to come in to talk about how things are going. And we can make it, the conversation can make it not seem so daunting to the senior generation so that they start the conversation.
Thank you. And then the other side of it, another question, my son wants to spend money like crazy. How do I teach him how difficult it is to pay back?
Yeah, so this isn't the first time I've got that question. And an aspect that I will dive deeper than, okay, well, my son wants to spend like crazy. My question would be, what's the current setup? Is your son involved in the operation? Is he the one who's just simply buying the assets? And how much financial information does he have? I often find that senior generation will bring in junior generation on a transaction basis. So we're buying new equipment, we're considering an upgrade on whatever. And it's the information that they have, that the junior generation has, is very specific to that one transaction. And so it doesn't go back to understanding the working capital. And so from the senior generation's perspective, it looks like they think that they're spending like crazy, and the junior generation doesn't understand the actual income and expenses that business has. And so sometimes it's about managing the access to information, so that can kind of position with the junior generation, oh, we can't continuously do that. Because if they don't understand that, they don't see the limits that they have to work within. The second part is sometimes debt for the junior generation is a really good thing. I often run into scenarios where the junior generation gets a lot of support. A lot of things are organized for them because it's the farm expense. They don't have a cell phone, they don't have a visa. Everything's done through the business because it's more efficient that manner. But that means that they haven't had a lot of smaller level financial requirements where they've had to pay back their own, that they've had to figure out the discipline to make sure, well, we have enough money in that account. If it's not something that's on their mental radar, they tend to make it easy because, quite frankly, the senior generation has made it easy for them. So one of the steps that I often encourage is, do they have debt of their own? And if not, maybe that's a good place to start. Some real life experience of how to manage debt.
Thank you. Next one close to my heart, I guess. My daughter-in-law is very pushy, and how do I help prepare her for the discussions and the transition planning?
Yeah, I'm a daughter-in-law. I'm pretty talkative. Sometimes I can be pushy, so I can really relate to this one in some levels. But at the same point, I'm going to put the kind of commentary aside, and I'm going to ask more information. So, how long has this daughter-in-law been around? Like, if she's new to the family and she's really excited and wants to be engaged in the conversation, maybe you take the pushy and the talkative aspect of that and you're misinterpreting it. She wants to learn and she's asking a lot of questions. That would be, so understanding what the actual relationship dynamic is with that daughter-in-law. Because if this is a different scenario, and I'm going to say the daughter-in-law has been in the family for 10, 15 years, and all of a sudden she started to push back more. All of a sudden she's starting to have more concerns. One of the questions I would ask is, are these her concerns, or are these the son's concerns as well, that the son is not communicating? There's more going on than just it being a daughter-in-law issue. I know there's a book out there about the daughter-in-law on the farm and how do you deal with that element. But I tend to see that if there's a daughter-in-law concern, there tends to be more, and understanding the whole relationship and what's going on can be helpful in figuring out how we're going to deal with, or how you can identify some steps to deal with that conversation.
Okay, thank you. I have one last of the previously submitted questions. So I'll invite anyone who is participating who hasn't asked their question yet to post it to the chat line. Also, under that chat function, if you open it up, you can download the checklist that Andrea has been talking about. We'll also email it out to the participants after the meeting. The last question was, if I don't have a clear successor, why should I be using these 7 steps? Why do I need a plan?
The reality is, even if you don't have a successor, you've amassed a significant amount of assets. You have a business, and if you're not going to be having the conversation about, you know, bringing in the next successor that you know, then you may be discussing, do I sell the business? How do I sell that business? And the information that I outlined in this conversation is going to be helpful for your technical advisors to help you through evaluating other options, whether that be selling your assets, whether that be maybe even moving to a management consortium, or whatever the case is. Taking the time to organize and understand those 7 steps are independent of whether you have a successor or not.
Thank you, Andrea. I see that it's posted. Where is the list? You should be able to see it at the very top of the chat function. If it's not showing, I can see it myself. So I'm hoping you can all see it. If not, we will send it out to everyone who registered for the webinar by email.
Can we maybe even just post it, like, can we share the screen so that people can see it here? That might be helpful for them to take a look at what's actually included.
So I'm checking to see if you can see it. I took over the screen share from Jillian.
There you go.
Okay.
If we can maybe just get that zoomed in a little bit. So each of the 7 categories will have, again, a prompt of what to do, what your action is for each of those items. And then this has been compiled with the help of FCC as well as BDO. So there's some BDO specific shares in here, but they're really good information. And so everything's complimentary. There's not going to be any like paywalls or any of that kind of situation. So regardless of whoever your accountant is, this is good information to look through and kind of organize yourself.
I want to thank you, Andrea, for being with us today. I think that succession or transition planning is something that is easy to put off to another day. And a lot of it is because we maybe don't know where to start. It is a process. And I thank you for providing us with some really concrete action items to help get started. For the participants, there will be, this is the first in a series, so there will be another webinar on Wednesday, February 9th with Eric Weber, business finance specialist with OMAFRA. And he'll be exploring government programs and private lending versus traditional loans and overall financing discussion. And if there are other topics that you want to explore more fully, Andrea's given us a really broad overview in a fairly short period of time. So if there's something else that you would like us to explore deeply in webinars, please let me know at the GGO office, and we can see what we can do to arrange other topics. With that, I want to thank you, Andrea, and thank you to Farm Credit Canada for sponsoring this webinar. Have a good afternoon, folks.